Before we read these verses, maybe you've not been around over the last few weeks as we've looked at this book, or maybe you have done, but it would be helpful to have a little reminder. Where we left things last week was that Esther and Mordecai are Jewish people in the empire of Medo-Persia 2,500 years ago. And last week, an enemy appeared, someone called Haman. And Haman has both planned and produced a plot to kill every Jewish person across the whole empire. Mordecai and Esther have a plan to try to stop this from happening. And how they're going to do that is that Esther, who is the queen, she is going to go in to her husband and plead for the lives of her people. Now, before we read the actual, that's the background, before we read the actual story, let me say that this is hilarious. Whether or not you find it hilarious is a different question. It is a categorical fact that it is hilarious. It is so funny. Karen Jobes, a great commentator on the book of Esther, said, "This is arguably the most ironically comic scene in the entire Bible. We should be ready to read this, hoping that we will see what makes it funny. We should be laughing all the way through." And I want us to think about these chapters in this way. If you flick ahead in your Bible to Esther chapter 9, verse 1, that's obviously beyond what we're reading today, you will read the phrase that the narrator uses to talk about the whole book of Esther: the tables were turned. That feels like quite a modern phrase. The tables were turned. Everything turned around back on the heads of those who were wanting to do harm and for those who needed to be protected. The tables were turned. And as we read these 3 chapters, I would love you to look out for places where the tables are turned. Look out for where there are reversals in the text. Esther chapter 5, verse 1, let me read. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I am the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." That is what we're meant to do, Michael. Thank you. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, let them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banqueting hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Can you remember a time in your life where everything turned around for you? Maybe even a moment that at the time you didn't realize what was happening, an event or a period when, as you look back, the trajectory of things changed. Why don't you take a moment to talk about that with the people around you? This morning, we are coming to the very central part of the story of Esther. This is not the climax, but we might call it the beating heart. This is the section where the author wants all of our attention to be drawn to. He wants us to be really attentive as we see what's going on. We've already had it read. Just a reminder of what the situation is with the people we've met so far in the book. Here's some brief bios. There's Xerxes. We've seen that he is the most powerful man in the world. He's also dangerous and ridiculous. He's never had an original idea in his life, and he loves a banquet. That's mainly what we know about him. There's Mordecai, a righteous man who has been overlooked and is in great danger. Then there's Esther, our heroine. She's been on the longest journey of everyone. She started just like us, someone who was completely helpless. She went through the most terrible oppression. And yet, she's now the queen of the world's greatest empire, but has agreed to be the mediator for her people at the risk of her own life. And finally, there's Haman, as we called him in a holiday Bible club in the past, horrible Haman. He's an Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. That's the cast of characters. Are you ready for the heart of the story? The first thing we see in chapter 5, verses 1 to 8, is Esther's wisdom. So you remember that Esther had called for all the Jewish people to fast for 3 days because she is about to go into King Xerxes and plead with him for all of their lives. So let me read verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. Here it is, we're getting it set up for us. D-Day for Esther. Everything hangs in the balance. Can you notice in this verse how time slows down? In the first few chapters, we've sped through 9 years, but now we're focusing on the details. Where Esther is standing, where Xerxes is sitting, what direction they're facing, what Esther is wearing. She's put on her royal robes. Make no mistake, She's not just a mistress, she's the queen. She has dignity and nobility. She deserves respect. Last week, Esther had identified herself as one of God's people. And she's about to reveal that fact to Xerxes. But it seems that in doing this, she's better able to claim what is hers by marriage, who she is in all senses. She's a royal. In this book, she's called Queen Esther 16 times, and 15 of them come from chapter 5 on. Esther is taking on this mantle of mediator of her people. She's not just the queen of Persia. Esther is the queen of the Jews. Xerxes sees Esther. And hopefully you can remember from last week the danger that she's in. I read this week about a relief, just like this relief that was found in Persepolis. This one here is probably of Darius sitting on the throne. That's Xerxes' father. And Xerxes, the crown prince, would be behind him. I don't know if you can make out two people behind. Can you spot what is in that person's hand? No, the answer is no. That's fine. It's an axe right there. See that? That is the executioner ready to swipe. When you go into the throne room, there is a fatal blow waiting for you. Esther's entering the death chamber. And so we read in verse 2, when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. This is what we were fearing last week. Phew, a huge relief. Esther isn't instantly executed. She wins the king's favor again. She did that in chapter 2. This is a moment of irony. Remember that Queen Vashti refused to come to the king and was deposed. But here Esther comes to the king with no invitation and has been welcomed. It's a first hint that maybe things are going to change. But we need to remember that Esther still isn't safe. There's such a long way to go and so much to overcome. She, along with her people, are on death row still. And Xerxes knows that Esther must want something from him in order for her to risk her life and come like this. And what he says in verse 3 shows that he's willing to give her whatever it is that she wants. But look at what Esther does. In verse 4, she talks to him with great wisdom. If it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. She doesn't just blurt out her request. She doesn't just say what she wants. She asks Xerxes to go to a banquet. That's his favorite thing in the whole world. And she invites Haman too. We wonder why, but we think she might have a plan. So they go and they have this feast together. And again, Xerxes says, Esther, what do you want? I'll give it to you. And again, Esther answers strategically. She's not delaying here. It's not that she's a bit worried about what she's going to say. She's not scared. No, she's got this under control. Look at the way she says it in verse 8. It's almost as if Xerxes accepts the invitation to the second banquet, and we know that Xerxes is going to come to a banquet, he's kind of duty-bound to do whatever she asks. It's brilliant. Esther is so wise. It made me think of the traitors. Sorry if you haven't seen The Traitors this year. If not, this won't make much sense. But if you did, then this will be the best part of your morning. Can you remember what happened in the confessional booth? Harriet and Mattie had the opportunity to ask the traitors 2 questions. Now, I'm not clever enough to have done what they did. They were both so wise. The traitors could lie, so they had to ask a question that would be revealing in some way anyway. Harriet, there she is, she decided to reveal that she suspected Rachel was a traitor. I will come for you, she said. Do you remember? And then Mattie, he tried to get recruited as a traitor. It was genius how they did it. That's a little bit like Esther here. She has a game plan. She hasn't jumped in at the first opportunity. She's trying to play the long game. She wants to succeed. She's wisely playing her hand. Here's what Proverbs 16 verse 22 says. Prudence is a fountain of life to the prudent. If you are wise and you use your wisdom, you'll have a great life. What we've seen with Esther so far is that she has already wisely aligned herself with her God and his people. And as soon as she does that, it seems that God has endowed her with even more wisdom. She's equipped for her task. She's living really well. She's doing an excellent job. And this is just a side point to note, but we can learn something from all this. As God's people, if we've made the wisest decision of following Jesus, we can increasingly and should increasingly live wisely and prudently. Think about Esther here. It's not just that she has something to say and so she says it. She wants to be heard. And so she thinks about how her words are going to have the best opportunity of bringing about what she wants. That is wisdom. Thinking well about practical things in life. And God grants his people increasing wisdom to live wisely, not just spiritually, but practically. To use every situation and opportunity we have for the best purposes, for his purposes. That's the first little section, Esther's wisdom, but that's immediately contrasted in verses 9 to 14 with Haman's folly. Because there's more to that verse from Proverbs. It says, prudence is a fountain of life to the prudent, but folly brings punishment to fools. See Exhibit A. Haman leaves this banquet on top of the world in verse 9. He could not imagine things getting any better for him. A private banquet with the king and queen. It's all he's ever wanted. He has made it. But let me read from halfway through verse 9. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Mordecai is like a stone in his shoe. No matter what else is going on, when he sees Mordecai, everything good evaporates. He thinks his life is ruined and it becomes the only thing that matters. Of course, that gives us an insight into Haman's heart. It's warped and it's wicked. Verse 11 gives us another insight into his heart. He gathers his friends and family together for a TED talk called Why I Am So Amazing. He boasts about his wealth, his sons, his position. The ego has landed. A fool's heart blurts out folly. That's another proverb. And that's what Haman's doing here. Because we've already had the passage read to us. Every single thing that he's boasting about in this verse is about to be taken away from him. Because pride goes before a fall. That's another proverb, isn't it? Can you see what's going to happen to Haman? He's not living wisely. He's a fool. But at this point in the story for Haman, the cherry on the top is this banquet that he's been to. If he'd had a phone, he'd be showing his family selfies of him, Xerxes, and Esther, #besties, showing them the invite for the next day that he's got. But then in verse 13, he says to them what we've seen already. All this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. Can you hear the hatred? This is a brief but true insight into what life is like for those who aren't God's people. We were thinking about that in Hope Explored this week. We were looking at our purpose. Look at Haman. He has sought to find his purpose in his bank account, which he boasts about, his children, which he boasts about, his career and his connections, which he has achieved everything that he could have done. There's no way that things could have gone any better for him. That's been his purpose in life. But it's not enough. It doesn't satisfy him. He's thrown off all that he has achieved by one bloke who doesn't bow down to him. Life apart from God, life if we're not a Christian, cannot satisfy us. Because whatever it is that we want, we will struggle to get. And even if we do, it will never be enough. As Rico Tice said in the video we watched in small group, with all humility, I can say that as a Christian, I do have a real purpose. Because Jesus Christ, God's Son, satisfies us. He satisfies us because he is and gives us everything we've ever hoped for and far more than we could ever dream. To choose to follow him like Esther is wisdom and will lead to living wisely and having a good life. To choose not to follow him is folly. And the consequences will be that our life, even if it gets good on the face of it, will have an underlying niggle where we know it's not enough. One other thing that Haman has got, which he doesn't boast about, is a lovely wife, Zeresh. They're a match made in, well, I'll let you figure it out. Look at what she says in verse 14. This is her solution to Mordecai. Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. First of all, it's a comically large gallows. It's 75 feet high. I don't even know how that would work. This is a Persian execution method. It's brutal and very public. But Zeresh sees that Haman isn't going to be enjoying the king's banquet, and so her solution is obvious. Kill him in the morning. Then you can go and have fun, undisturbed by Mordecai. As we get to the end of chapter 5, we note that Esther's plan didn't account for any of this. She's gone to try and save herself and her people. Maybe she's overplayed her hand, waiting till the next day, because sadly, it looks like Mordecai is toast. But the next thing we see in chapter 6, verses 1 to 14, is that the tables turn. Just glance down again at verses 1 to 5. Some of them are going to be on the screen. As we look at chapter 6, verses 1 to 5, there could not be a more innocuous set of events. We're told that the king can't sleep. Put your hand up if you couldn't sleep at least once this week. Okay, innocuous, very, very normal. And so the king asks for a bedtime story to get him over. Put your hands up if you couldn't sleep and you decided to try and read. That's something that I did this week, and twice the book fell and hit me on the head. It woke me up even more. But Xerxes' book is a historical record of his own reign. Now, that might send us to sleep, but it sounds like Xerxes likes his own success as much as Haman. And just randomly, by chance, the person who was reading the book to him turned to the page where it outlined what we saw back in chapter 2, that Mordecai uncovered an assassination plot against Xerxes. Can you remember that? It was an assassination plot by Teresh and Bigthana. Thana only got the job because of his size. Mordecai saved the king's life. As Xerxes remembers this, something nudges him to ask. Maybe there's a niggle in his mind. What did I give to Mordecai as a thank you? What do we expect him to give? Maybe a carriage clock. That's what we would probably give him. In those days, probably it was more likely to be a governorship. Herodotus, the Greek historian, tells us that later in his reign, Xerxes gave someone who saved the life of his brother exactly that, the governorship of an island. So imagine what Mordecai should get for saving Xerxes' life. But Xerxes can't quite remember the ceremony in which he gave the gift. And he's astounded in verse 3 to find out that the answer is nothing. Nothing has ever happened. Mordecai has been overlooked. And in Persian culture, this needs to be amended immediately. Xerxes is messed up big time. This is bad news if his courtiers hear that he's not good at repaying thanks and favor. And so he asks, who is around? He needs some advice, obviously. Xerxes hasn't got an original bone in his body. And then look at verse 4. Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he'd set up for him. This verse is stated in such a way that Haman walks through the door at the same moment as Xerxes asks, who is here? It's like the answer to the question is Haman. And we know that Xerxes and Haman both want to talk to each other about Mordecai, but for quite different reasons, right? One wants to lift him up to a pole, and one wants to, in some way, lift him up in his position. How innocuous are all of these events? It's just random. If we were telling this story, we might say, it just so happened that this, and then it just so happened that that, and it just so happened that the other thing. But the author of this story has actually put these verses at the very heart of his narrative. We're not going to go into this for a huge amount of time, but if you want to talk to me about it later, you could, because I'm excited by it. But the whole structure of the book of Esther points us to this section. There are 8 feasts in the book of Esther. As you might have seen, there's a lot of banquets. And if you can see there, number 1 and 2 are mirrored with number 7 and 8. The banquets at the start for Xerxes, 180 days, and then 7 days at the end, because the story is going to end well. There are 2 celebrations for the reversal of fortunes. And then we have a banquet for the Esther's coronation and also for Mordecai's elevation. And in the middle, there are these 2 banquets that Esther prepares for Xerxes and Haman. And in between them, like the meat in the sandwich, are these verses. This is called a chiastic structure, which ancient authors cleverly used to point us to the middle bit. They wanted us to know that the best thing isn't the bread, and definitely isn't the butter, and it's not the lettuce. It is the meat in the middle. That's what we're meant to enjoy the most. And this event here happens between banquet 4 and 5, between Esther's 2 banquets. This is the moment the tables turn. In the story after this, there is no going back. Up until this point, we've seen the odds stacked against Esther and Mordecai and the Jewish people. But after this point, they're on the rise. And it's Haman who's sliding towards his destiny. The author wants us to see that these aren't just innocuous events. They're God-ordained events. The king couldn't sleep. The book was opened on page 4,375. Xerxes just asked about Mordecai's reward. Haman just walked into the building. None of it random. All according to God's plan at the exact right moment. It all happened for such a time as this, in the words of the book of Esther. Can't you see that? The invisible God is right here if we have eyes to see. The author doesn't mention him, but by his structure, he writes him into the story. In chapters 1 and 2, we saw the power and machinations of the empire. From this moment, we see the power and machinations of the sovereign God, who has been working throughout the whole story to bring about the good of his people and his own glory. And we immediately begin to see all of that unfold. This here is just delicious irony. Surely you can taste it. In verse 6, Xerxes asks Haman for advice. What should happen to the person I want to honor? And we read this hilarious sentence. Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? He can't get his head round anyone other than himself. The title of his autobiography would be Me, Myself, and I. He's full of himself. It's like he's found a genie in a bottle who's granted him a wish. Now, what have we seen already? If only Haman would be wise like Esther, if he would take his time, not blurt out the first thing that came into his mind, have a plan, maybe ask, can I just clarify who it is we're talking about here, Xerxes? That would help him. But he's a fool. And he says everything that he would like. This is like his daydream, and his daydreams are sycophantic. It's like the Jungle Book. I want to be like you. I want to walk like you. I want to talk like you. I want to wear your clothes. I want to ride your horse. He's trying to ingratiate himself. I did think about singing that, and I bottled it just 10 seconds ago. He's trying to ingratiate himself to the emperor in every way he can. And so let's read verse 10 in all its ironic glory. And then when we've read it, talk with the people around you about how many different ways Xerxes unwittingly rubs the situation in for Haman. Okay? Verse 10. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested, for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, do not neglect anything you have recommended. Take 30 seconds. How is that verse just not what Haman wants to hear? There's so many ways in which this verse is just the worst news for Haman. He's told to go at once. There's no delay. It's a command. He has to obey it. He reminds Haman that this is his suggestion. You've done it yourself. He calls Mordecai the Jew. This is why Haman hates him. He mentions the king's gate, which is the place that Mordecai doesn't bow down. And he ends it by saying, remember to do every single detail of the great things you have suggested. The tables have turned. Can you see it? In verse 11 we read, so Haman got the robe and the horse. The author doesn't tell us any more than that, but can you imagine? Haman, has to honor Mordecai. This is the opposite of what he wanted. When he woke up that morning, he thought that by this time he'd have him up 50, 75 feet high on a pole. But instead he's helping him get on a horse that's wearing a crown. I don't even know what that's about. This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor, Haman has to proclaim again and again and again and again. Indeed it is, Haman. You're speaking more than you know. This is the man the King of Kings delights to honor. And you are his enemy. So think about what's about to happen to you. Well, Haman rushes home in grief. The drama kind of speeds up again. And he tells his family and friends what has happened. Look at what they respond like in verse 13. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. The game is up, they say. The tables have turned. They can see it. They even know it's got something to do with the fact that Mordecai is Jewish and has Yahweh as his God. We might wonder why they didn't mention this the day before, but still. And then the king's servants arrive and they hurry Haman away to the banquet. There's more speed. It's getting faster. And Haman is no longer his own man. He's in control of someone else now. Esther didn't die when she went into the king. Mordecai hasn't died when Haman wanted to kill him. There's still Esther's request of Xerxes. How is that going to go for the Jewish people? Well, I think we can guess. But finally, in chapter 7, all the way through to chapter 8, verse 2, we get to see victory secured, but not complete. We're at the banquet, and it's just dripping with dramatic irony. Think about where we are in chapter 7, verse 1. We know everything that's just happened, but what's happening with the characters? Esther doesn't know that Mordecai has been honored. Xerxes doesn't know that Haman wanted to kill Mordecai, who he's just honored. Neither Xerxes nor Haman know that Esther is Jewish, and only Esther knows that she's about to reveal Haman's plot for what it is. This is what's going on here. It's the best story. And the king is now desperate to know what Esther wants. Her strategy has completely worked. And Esther answers him with such wisdom when he asks again. She intrigues the king at first without mentioning Haman's name. She speaks here in Hebrew in very short sentences. She says, my petition, my life. My request, my people. It's a simple but effective, powerful speech. She quotes the decree that has been written, that her and her people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated Imagine Haman just popping another profiterole into his mouth, thinking, oh, I've heard that somewhere before. And maybe beginning to dawn on him what's about to happen. Esther even says tactfully that if she was going to become a slave, she wouldn't have bothered the king. And verse 5, we read, King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, see how they're equals now? Who is he? Where is he? It's like he can't get his words out. And then again, in staccato language, like an executioner's drum, Esther says, adversary and enemy, Haman. She's a queen, wise, noble woman who has identified herself with God's people and mediated for them effectively. She's a hero. Haman is terrified, no wonder, because he's caught in a trap. You see, court custom says that he's not allowed to stay in the room alone with Esther. He should actually leave. But of course, if he left, that would make him look guilty, which he is. And he can't exactly go out into the garden with Xerxes and hang out because Xerxes has his own problems. Xerxes' own ring marked this decree. The plan to kill the Jews has been formulated on his authority. How does he stop what's going to happen but still save face? By stopping what happens to the Jewish people? He's saying that he got it wrong. Well, again, at kind of just the right time, it all comes together when he walks back into the room to find Haman falling at Esther's feet, begging for his life. He's decided she's his best option. Commentators agree there's no chance Haman was actually trying to force himself on Esther, but Xerxes uses this moment as a pretense to arrest him. It gets him off the hook, as well as allows Haman to be dealt with. And at the end of verse 8 we read, as soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Just notice that the executioners are right there. Throughout this whole story, death is hanging around. At the start of the chapter, we feared for Esther's life. But instead, it's she who has forced judgment on Haman. And in one last dark comedy moment, this servant called Harbona speaks up. Oh, excuse me, sire. If you want him executed, there's actually a brand new state-of-the-art pole that's just been set up last night. 75 feet high it is. It'd be perfect for Haman. In fact, he knocked it up himself yesterday. And do you know why? Because that guy Mordecai, the one who saved your life? Yeah, he was trying to kill him. He kind of reveals the whole thing. And the king says, impale him on it. And they did. In the final show that the tables really have turned, we read chapter 8, verse 1, which is just triumphant. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Beautiful. Mordecai's reward has come at just the right time. Haman is gone, and his precious king's signet ring, along with his wealth and his position, is given to the person who he hated and tried to kill. I'm breathless. You couldn't write it. It's a true story, but it's amazing. How do you feel at the end of the narrative? Maybe at the very end, there's a possibility that you feel a little bit sorry for Haman. Maybe you feel like he's been treated harshly. I hope that the story has clearly presented him as a murderous tyrant who got what he deserved. He is God's enemy, but we might have a question in our mind, is this how God should treat his enemies? But we've seen in the book of Esther that God is the true king. God is the true power behind every throne. He is our creator. He is our sustainer. He is in charge. And because of who he is, he deserves all glory and honor and praise. But instead, like Haman, we all curve in on ourselves. As much as we laugh at Haman's pride, how stupid it is, we're all the main characters in our own story, aren't we? We're all about ourselves. And in that, we sin. Because we do not give God what he deserves, what he is owed, which is all praise. And the Bible is clear that the consequences of being God's enemy, of not giving him his due, and instead daydreaming and acting out things that will make ourselves the king, is that we face the same end as Haman got, death. But in Esther we see that that's not the end of the story. Because Esther and Mordecai live, and they're God's people. And today, God's people live through faith in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus Christ was the man who the king delighted to honor. And yet he gave it all up. To be born in a stable, not a palace. To live an unremarkable life for 30 years with no particular achievements. Someone who was without honor even in his own town. And Jesus Christ wasn't led around a city on a horse with a crown. He came into city on a donkey, humbly. He was only crowned with a crown of thorns. He too was impaled on a pole. The Persian idea was that this was a death type that cursed you. And Jesus too died on a cursed tree, the cross. But he did that not senselessly or by chance, but as a mediator, to stand in front of his people as a shield, so that as we face the consequences of not giving God his due, Jesus took that punishment for us. God's right wrath against sin was taken on Jesus so that we could become God's people, his friends and his family, and have life. You see, every shadow in the book of Esther, it takes the shape as it spreads across the landscape of the cross of Christ. This morning, each of us can move from the prospect of death to the promise of life simply by believing that Jesus' death was for you. And as you do so, your sin will be forgiven and you will be saved. It will be the wisest choice you've ever made. And you will be endowed with great wisdom to live the rest of your life. That is the gospel as we see it in the book of Esther. But there's one more thing that we can see in this passage if we are one of God's people. I read, this book earlier this month. A bit of light reading. 8 Days in May, How Germany's War Ended. It was a book that was about the Second World War from a German perspective. From the day after Adolf Hitler died, when power was transferred to a man called Karl Donitz, and he led the Donitz regime. In those 8 days, the Nazi military infrastructure was crumbling, the Allies were advancing, everything was going wrong, but yet they did not surrender. The Donitz regime lasted for only 8 days. And then the victory that had been secured for so long was finally complete. That's a bit like the story of Esther. We've left it here in the end of chapter 7, beginning of chapter 8, with victory secured, but not yet complete. You see, there's still a long way to go in the story. The decree still stands. There's 11 months before the 13th of Adar comes round, and we'll have to wait until next week to see what happens. Esther and Mordecai are alive, but what of all of the Jewish people? And we've seen that the tables have turned. And so God will win. And that indicates to us that as we look back on the cross was where Jesus Christ secured victory. When he was raised and ascended to heaven, he gained all the honor that he was due. And this proves that he has definitively defeated the great enemy, Satan, and all his evil powers. Sin and death and hell have lost their power over us. The tables have turned and the march is unstoppable. But the victory is not yet complete, is it? And so we live in the now and not yet. We live in Esther chapter 8, verse 2. Between the cross and glory. We can be sure that God wins, but life now doesn't always look like it. And so as we look at this passage, while the clock is ticking until that final whistle, we need to live recognizing that God is in control. The cross shows us that he has turned the tables, that he has won, that no enemy will ever defeat him or us. It is sure. And that changes everything. It changes how we think about life and death. It changes incredibly how we think about sickness and darkness. It changes unbelievably how we think about circumstances and pain. It affects what we do with our money troubles and our relationship worries, all of life's hardships, because they are real and they are hard and they are painful. But in light of the cross, we see that they are just the death throes of the enemy. That is what they are. In all of these things as Christians, we can look back at the work of Jesus Christ and we can know with certainty that the tables have turned, the tide is with us, that we are on our way in a procession to the end where there's a crown of glory waiting. Brothers and sisters, I hope you see that God's fingerprints are all over the book of Esther. And I hope that you know that God's fingerprints were all over the work of Christ on the cross. And so we can see that God's fingerprints are all over all of our lives in ways that we could never design, to work out everything, every little detail, every difficult circumstance for his glory and our good, because we can see that the tables have turned. Let's pray together. Father, God in heaven, we pray that this great truth, as it is shown to us in part in the book of Esther, although so dramatically and so well told, that the whole of history is turned around for your purposes, that we would see that so clearly at the cross as we come to celebrate communion together in a moment. Would we be thankful for what you've done for us? And would we know that this is what we have now in part, but in whole, it will come to us one day. We thank you that victory is secured, and we praise you that though it is not complete, it will be one day. And may we live our lives this day in light of that truth. In the name of your Son, the Lord Jesus. Amen.